Of course, the foundation has been shaken, but the true earthquake is yet to come. The quiet heart is about to be tested by a storm of revelations. Rebuilding a life, viewers, doesn't start with grand gesture. It doesn't start with a triumphant return to the stock exchange or a dramatic lawsuit. It starts in the silent, lonely corners of soul that is chosen, for just one more day, not to give up. For Julian, it started with a room service club sandwich. He ate it, every last bite, even though it tasted like cardboard and shame. He did it because it was an order he had given himself, a direct response to Maria's note. A quiet heart is a strong heart. He didn't feel strong. He felt absurd. A billionaire alone in a hotel room, forcing down a sandwich as an act of rebellion. But the next day, he did it again. He ordered breakfast. Then he took a shower. A long, scalding one, but he got in. He shaved off the ragged beard that made him look like a castaway. The face in the mirror was thinner, older, the eyes shadowed with grief. But it was his face, not the monsters, not the victims. He called Arthur Brigham. "Do not engage with Thorne's lawsuit," he said, his voice quieter than his lawyer was used to, but firmer than it had been in months. "File a motion to dismiss. Call it what it is, a frivolous, defamatory publicity stunt. But do it through the proper channels. No press releases. No theatrics." Brigham was silent for a moment. "Julian, that's a very measured response. They'll see it as weakness." "Let them," Julian said, surprising himself. "I'm not playing their game anymore." He wasn't. He was starting a new one, with rules he didn't yet understand. The fire of vengeance was banked, for now. In its place was a slower, steadier burn. The rebuilding fire. It was fueled not by hatred, but by a desperate, fragile need to prove to himself that he was more than this story. He couldn't face his corporate office, the pitying stares of his employees. So he did something he hadn't done since he was a hungry grad student with a laptop and a dream. He went to a public library. The silence was different here. It wasn't the oppressive silence of his hotel or the hollow silence of his penthouse. It was a productive silence, a thinking silence. He set up at a Corel and opened his laptop. He began to read. He read every line of the Varicon deal he'd been too distracted to finish. He analyzed the metrics of the investor who had pulled out. He immersed himself in the cold, hard logic of numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't betray. They were a sanctuary. And every day, like a ritual, he would allow himself one small act of connection. He would text Maria. The messages were never profound. Asterisk, the safe was empty. Thank you for checking. Asterisk, asterisk, do you know where the building superstored the winter patio furniture? Asterisk, they were excuses. Threads thrown across the chasm of his loneliness. And every time, Maria would answer with simple, factual grace. Asterisk, of course, sir. It was no trouble. Asterisk, asterisk, I believe it is in Storage B, Unit 4C. Asterisk, she never asked for anything. She never offered unsolicited advice. She was just there, a steady, calm presence on the other end of the digital void. She was the keeper of the quiet heart. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling 4 hours of untangling a financial mess one of his nervous VPs had created, he texted her a different kind of message. Asterisk, the library cafe makes terrible coffee. Asterisk, a moment later, his phone buzzed. Asterisk, the trick is to ask for an extra shot. It doesn't make it good, but it makes it stronger, like life. Asterisk, Julian stared at the message. A joke. She had made a joke. He found a smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like a geological age. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. He was building something. Brick by brick, moment by moment. A sandwich, a shower, a dismissed motion in court, a smile. It was a new foundation, and it was being laid not in boardrooms or penthouses, but in the quiet, humble spaces of a library and the kindness of a maid. He was so focused on laying his next brick that he never saw the truth coming. It wasn't a brick. It was a wrecking ball. That small smile, sometimes that's all it takes to keep going. Are you starting to see a change in Julian? Let me know in the comments. The story is about to take a turn so sharp, you'll need to hold on. So make sure you subscribed and click that bell. The text from Arthur Brigham was terse. Motion to dismiss granted. Thorne's case thrown out. A win. Call me. Julian felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was muted. It wasn't a victory over Evelyn and Gabriel. It was simply the removal of a nuisance. He was in the library, and he preferred the quiet. He decided to call Brigham later. Instead, he found himself staring at a screen, not at financials, but at Gabriel Thorne's Instagram profile. He hated himself for doing it, for feeding the beast, but he couldn't help it. He needed to understand the enemy. He needed to see the man who had so completely unraveled his life. He scrolled past the pictures with Evelyn, the pain now a familiar ache rather than a fresh wound. He looked at Thorne's older posts, from before the affair became public. Photos of his sculptures, twisted, angry metal shapes. Pictures of him at dive bars, looking brooding and intense. The man was a cliché. But then Julian's eye, the eye that had built a fortune on noticing details others missed, caught something. In the background of a photo from 8 months ago, a group of people were laughing at a bar. Gabriel was in the foreground, but behind him, slightly blurred, was another man. A man with a sharp, familiar face and an expensive watch that glinted under bar lights. Lucas Shaw. Julian's blood went cold. Lucas Shaw was his former protege, the golden boy of his firm, the man he'd trusted implicitly, until 6 months ago when Julian had been forced to fire him for embezzlement. It had been a quiet, internal matter. Julian, foolishly, had been trying to protect the kid's future. He'd allowed Shaw to resign rather than face criminal charges. What was his disgrace? Embezzling former protege, doing in a bar with Gabriel Thorne months before Julian even knew Thorne existed. The coincidence was too large. It was a planet-sized red flag. The quiet heart hammered against his ribs. The analytical part of his brain, the part Maria had helped him rediscover, kicked into overdrive. He began cross-referencing dates. Shaw's embezzlement had been clever, siphoning small amounts from various venture capital funds Julian managed. He pulled up the records of the shell company Evelyn had used to fund Gabriel's art, the dates of the transfers, the amounts, and then he saw it, the pattern, the signature. It was identical to Shaw's embezzlement scheme. The same obfuscation techniques, the same routing numbers, the same incremental increases. It was Shaw's work, but Shaw was gone. Unless he wasn't. A terrible, horrifying picture began to develop in the developing fluid of his mind. What if Gabriel Thorne wasn't the mastermind? What if he was just a handsome, empty vessel, the tool? What if this wasn't a crime of passion? What if it was a corporate takeover? He thought of Evelyn's coldness during the confrontation, her defiance. It hadn't felt like the guilt of a woman caught in an affair. It had felt like the confidence of a partner in a business negotiation. Because that's what it was. Lucas Shaw knew everything about Julian's business, his weaknesses, his personal life. He'd been like a son. He had been planning his revenge for being fired. He had sought out Evelyn, found her lonely and resentful. He had introduced her to Gabriel, a pretty face to act as the perfect distraction. The fair was the glittering lure. The real hook was the systematic financial bleeding. They weren't just spending his money. They were transferring his wealth. They were using the chaos of the very public, very salacious divorce to hide a much quieter, much more devastating heist. Evelyn hadn't just betrayed him as a wife. She had betrayed him as a business partner. She had allied herself with a man who wanted to destroy his empire, using her spousal access to help him do it. The revelation didn't bring rage. It brought a cold, terrifying clarity. The shattering he'd experienced months ago was nothing compared to this. That had been the destruction of his heart. This was the annihilation of his entire reality. He had been playing checkers. They were playing chess, and they had him in checkmate. He stood up from the library corral, his legs unsteady. The quiet sanctuary now felt like a cage. He had to get out. He had to think. He stumbled out into the afternoon light, blind to the world around him. He had the truth. The bigger, uglier, more devastating truth. But what in God's name was he supposed to do with it? This changes everything, doesn't it? The betrayal is so much deeper than he ever imagined. If your mind is reeling, type exploding head in the comments. This is just the beginning of the end game. Julian didn't go back to the hotel. He walked. He walked for miles, through streets he owned parts of and past buildings that bore his name, feeling like a ghost in his own kingdom. The cold, analytical part of his brain was already strategizing, running scenarios, but it was being drowned out by a tsunami of pure, undiluted hurt. This wasn't just a financial attack. It was a personal one, crafted by the two people he had let closest to his heart. Lucas, the son he never had. Evelyn, the wife he thought he'd built a life with. Their betrayal was a surgical strike, designed to leave no part of him intact. He found himself outside the Modern Art Museum. There was a new exhibit. A sign featured a familiar, brooding face, Gabriel Thorne. New Visions, The Ascendance of Gabriel Thorne. Sponsored by the Evelyn Croft Foundation. The audacity, the sheer mocking all of it, using his name, his money, to launch her lover's career while she and her co-conspirator looted his empire. The quiet heart shattered. The beast he had been keeping caged broke free. He didn't think. He acted. He called a number he'd promised himself he'd never call again. She answered on the second ring, her voice a carefully modulated blend of surprise and annoyance. "Julian?" "My lawyer said." "Where are you?" he interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I'm at the loft, finalizing the installation for the show." "What is this about?" "Stay there," he said. "We're going to talk. Without lawyers." He hung up before she could respond. He hailed a cab, his body thrumming with energy he hadn't felt since his collapse. It wasn't strength. It was a final, furious burn of star-going supernova. The loft was in Tribeca, a raw, expansive space paid for with his money. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open. Evelyn was there, standing beside a hulking, twisted metal sculpture. She looked impeccable, annoyed, and utterly in control. Gabriel was there too, posing for a photographer, looking every bit the suffering artist. "Julian," Evelyn said, her voice icy. "You can't just barge in here." "Get out," Julian said to the photographer, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man grabbed his equipment and scurried away. Gabriel puffed out his chest. "You need to leave, man. I'll call the police." "Call them." Julian spat, not even looking at him. His eyes were locked on Evelyn. "Tell them the man you're conspiring with to commit grand larceny is here. I'm sure they'd love to hear all about Lucas Shaw." The name landed like a live grenade. Evelyn's composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture, a slight widening of the eyes, a tiny intake of breath. But it was enough. Julian saw it. He saw the truth flash in her eyes before she could hide it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but the confidence was gone from her voice. "Don't you?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This was never about him, was it? He jerked his head toward Gabriel, who now looked confused and less sure of himself. "He's a pretty face. The distraction. This was always about you and Lucas. My wife and my son. My two greatest betrayals. Working together." He saw her calculated mind working, trying to find an angle, a lie to spin. "You were neglectful, Julian," she shot back, a desperate defense. "You left me alone. Lucas understood me. He saw what you did to me. So you helped him steal from me? You let that parasite," he finally turned his gaze to Gabriel, "put his hands on you for the sake of a business deal? What does that make you, Evelyn? Because it doesn't make you a victim. It makes you a whore." Gabriel moved then, putting a protective arm around Evelyn. "That's enough. You don't talk to her like that." Julian finally looked at him, and his laughter was bitter and cold. "You poor, stupid boy. Do you really think you're anything more than a paid actor? A well-compensated gigolo? Ask her about the wire transfers. Ask her about Lucas Shaw. See how long she keeps you around once the money dries up." The confusion on Gabriel's face deepened into dawning horror. He looked at Evelyn. "Evie? What is he talking about?" Evelyn's face was a mask of fury and panic. The perfect narrative was crumbling in front of her, and she had no script for this. Julian had seen enough. The confrontation was over. He had what he came for, the confirmation, and the sight of their alliance fracturing before his eyes. He turned to leave, the fire of his rage spent, leaving only cold ashes. "This isn't over, Julian," Evelyn hissed behind him. He stopped at the door and looked back at them, the broken king amidst the ruins of his life. "Oh, it is for me," he said, his voice now filled with a weary, final certainty. "The man you were trying to destroy? He's already gone. You're dealing with someone else now." He walked out, closing the door on the gilded cage of their lives. He had confronted the monsters, and he was still standing. But he was alone in the aftermath. There was only one person left in the world he could trust, and he knew exactly where he needed to go. The confrontation is over, but the war is not won. Julian is alone, but he's finally free of their lies. Where does he go now? The final steps toward redemption are just ahead. Don't forget to join my email circle for more. The link is in the description. The finale is next. Of course. The final act. The pieces are in place. The villains are exposed, and a broken man is about to discover that his greatest treasure was never in a bank vault. Have you ever reached the end of yourself? The point where the rage is burned out, the tears have all been shed, and you're just empty? That's where Julian was. He stood on the sidewalk outside the loft, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaching away, leaving him hollowed out and shaking. He had nowhere to go. The hotel was a sterile box of memories. His old life was a toxic waste dump. The future was a blank, terrifying page. His feet, however, seemed to know the way. They carried him, block after block, without any conscious instruction from his brain. He wasn't thinking of a destination. He was simply moving, a leaf on the current of his own exhaustion. He found himself standing in front of a modest, well-kept brownstone in Queens, a place he'd never been, but whose address he knew from the employment records he'd once glanced at years ago. Maria's home. He stood there for a long time, staring at the warm light glowing behind the front window. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say? Asterisk. Hello, my life is a ruin, my wife is a criminal, and I have no one. Can I come in? Asterisk. He was about to turn away, to retreat back into the darkness, when the front door opened. Maria stood there, not in her maid's uniform, but in a simple, comfortable sweater and jeans. She wasn't surprised to see him. It was as if she'd been expecting him. Her eyes, always so perceptive, took in his shattered expression, the tremor in his hands. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer a hollow greeting. She simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in, sir. I just made tea." And Julian Croft, who had walked into palaces and boardrooms without a hint of hesitation, crossed the threshold into a small, warm living room filled with the smell of chamomile and baked goods, and felt like he was coming home. He sat on her sofa, a simple, worn thing that was infinitely more comfortable than any designer furniture he'd ever owned. He held the mug of tea she gave him, the warmth seeping into his frozen hands. And then he told her everything. The whole ugly, devastating truth about Lucas Shaw, about the conspiracy, about the calculated destruction of his life. The words poured out of him, a flood of pain and betrayal he had kept dammed up for months. Maria listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or offer dramatic reactions. She just listened, her quiet presence creating a space where his truth could finally exist without judgment. When he was finished, spent and empty, she spoke. Her voice was soft but firm. "A snake will always be a snake, Mr. Croft. You cannot be angry at it for biting. You can only learn to see it before it strikes next time." She wasn't absolving them. She was freeing him. She was telling him their nature was their failure, not his. "What do I do, Maria?" he asked, his voice of a lost boy. "I have the truth, but I have no proof that would stand in court. They've covered their tracks too well." Maria looked at him, her gaze steady. "You have been looking for a battle you can win with lawyers and money. That is the battle they want you to fight. It is the battle they built." She leaned forward slightly. What is the one thing they did not plan for? Julian looked at her, confused. "What?" "You," she said simply. "The man you are right now. The man who is not the powerful billionaire. The man who is sitting in my living room, humbled and honest and real. That is a variable they did not calculate." She stood up and went to a small desk, pulling out a simple notepad. "You asked me once why I was still there, packing the house. It was not just to finish my work." She handed him the notepad. It was filled with neat, meticulous notes. Dates, times, license plate numbers she'd seen from the penthouse window, descriptions of Lucas Shaw's car, the times he'd come to the building when Julian was away, long before Gabriel was ever in the picture. "I saw the pattern, sir," she said quietly. "I did not know what they meant, but I knew they were wrong. So I wrote them down. It is not a lawyer's proof, but it is a place to start, for a man who knows how to rebuild." Julian looked down at the notepad, then up at Maria. This woman, who everyone ignored, who was paid to be invisible, had seen everything. Her loyalty wasn't to his money or his status. It was to him, to the man she had seen struggling beneath the surface long before anyone else. In that moment, he didn't see his maid. He saw the wisest, strongest, most truly powerful person he had ever known. He saw his redemption. It wasn't in a courtroom victory. It wasn't in reclaiming his billions. It was in this quiet, steadfast loyalty. It was in this love, a word he now understood in its purest, most selfless form. He had come here seeking shelter. He had found an army of one. This moment, this is where everything changes. The strength of quiet loyalty. If Maria's actions resonate with you, share this video with someone who needs to see this kind of strength. Now for the final closing. The war for Julian's soul was over, and he had won. Not by destroying his enemies, but by finally realizing who his true ally had been all along. He didn't move from Maria's sofa that night. She insisted he take the spare room. He slept a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time since the betrayal. The next morning, over coffee that was infinitely better than any he'd had in months, They made a plan. Not a plan of attack, but a plan of reconstruction. Using Maria's notes as a roadmap, Julian didn't go after Evelyn and Lucas directly. That was the battle they expected. Instead, he went aboard of his company. He stood before them, not as the arrogant titan they knew, but as a humbled, honest man. He laid out the entire sordid story. He showed them Maria's timeline, connecting Lucas Shaw's presence to mysterious financial leaks that had begun even before his firing. He didn't ask for his old job back. He didn't demand revenge. He simply said, "I failed in my personal judgment, and it bled into the company. I am here to help you fix it in any way I can." His humility, his stark honesty, was more powerful than any display of force. The board, who had been ready to write him off, listened. They initiated a quiet, internal audit focused specifically on the timelines Maria had provided. The truth began to unravel. Evelyn and Lucas, expecting a bloody public fight, were caught completely off guard by the quiet, precise corporate investigation. Their carefully constructed house of cards began to collapse from the inside. The lawsuits evaporated as they were faced with overwhelming internal evidence. The love story between Evelyn and Gabriel, stripped of its financial engine and its narrative of victimhood, crumbled into dust and mutual recrimination. Julian didn't care. He was already building something new. He sold his stake in the company. He took a fraction of his former wealth and started a new fund, a smaller, ethical one. He worked from a small office, not a skyscraper. He hired based on character, not just resumes. And he asked Maria to not be his maid, but his chief of operations. She declined. She told him her strength was in seeing the small things, the human things, that others missed. She preferred to keep her life as it was. But she agreed to have dinner with him. Once a week. Those dinners became the anchor of his new life. They talked about everything. He learned about her life, her family back in Guatemala, her dreams. He learned how to listen. He learned how to be a man, not a monument. One evening, a year later, they were walking through a park after dinner. The fall leaves crunched under their feet. He stopped and turned to her. "Maria," he said, his voice full of emotion so profound it almost choked him. "You saved me. In every way a person can be saved." She smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "No, Mr. Croft. You just finally decided to save yourself. I simply handed you a tool." "It's Julian," he said. "Please, call me Julian." She nodded. Julian. In that moment, he was richer than he had ever been with billions. He had found redemption. Not in vengeance, but in grace. Not in wealth, but in love. The kind of love that isn't loud or flashy, but quiet, loyal, and unwavering. He had lost a fortune, a wife, and an empire, but he had found himself. And he had found her. And so, viewers, we leave Julian not on top of the world, but firmly, happily placed within it. His castle is smaller now, but its foundations are made of truth, and its walls are guarded by loyalty. His story is a reminder that the most devastating collapses often make room for the strongest rebuilds. That the people who are meant to be in your life aren't always the ones standing in the spotlight next to you. Sometimes, they're the ones quietly keeping the light on for you, waiting for you to find your way home. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet strengths in your own life, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So many of you have been on this journey with Julian, and your comments have been incredible. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the ending. And because stories like this are why I love doing what I do, I want to leave you with one last thing. Not every story I write finds its way to YouTube. Some are more personal. Some are lessons I've learned, and others are little surprises I saved just for those who want to be closer to my world of storytelling. I share them quietly with my email circle, a safe space where I can give you more than I can hear. Asterisk, asterisk. It's a place for us to continue the conversation beyond the videos. The link to join is in the description below. I'd be honored to have you there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Remember, no matter how dark it gets, just focus on the next right thing, even if it's just a bowl of soup. Until next time.